Okay, so again, welcome everyone to our workshop, Supporting Young People Who are Neurodiverse, or Neurodivergent, I should say. I'm Noelene Armstrong. I'm from the Northern Territory Lived Experience Network. Okay, first of all, it's really important that I acknowledge, do an acknowledgement of country. I'm joining you today from the Darwin region and want to pay my personal respects to Larrakia elders and the elders past, present, emerging and future, and acknowledge all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in attendance today, and that sovereignty of these lands has never been ceded. We're a lived experience run organisation, and it's also important to us, particularly in the context of today's presentation, that we acknowledge people with diverse abilities, in particular neurodivergent people. So there's a lovely little graphic there that just reminds us that we need neurodiversity to show us a new perspective, lead us on the path to change, teach us about authenticity, challenge outdated ideas, and show us beauty where we didn't see it before. It's also important that we acknowledge people with lived experience of mental health and related challenges, including family and kin who provide love and support. And we make a point of doing that acknowledgement because that is the thrust, I guess, of why our network came about, which was to try and create a voice for individuals and their families in systematic decisions for people impacted by mental health. So a little bit about me, I guess. I'm joining you as an adult with lived experience, and that includes being an individual who's autistic, as well as the parent to two young people who are autistic and from a large neurodivergent family. I also have my own individual experiences of mental health and related challenges, and provide love, support and advocacy to other adults in my family, as well as advocacy on behalf of my children. So I would, I'm not a real fan of the word consumer or carer particularly, but if any of you are familiar with that language, I would probably be someone who identifies as both. I wasn't always working in this sector. I worked for about 16 years as an engineer, but have always had an involvement in mental health advocacy dating back to my early 20s, when my brother's experiences emerged and became quite a significant issue for our family. And for the next 10 years, I'm not just an advocate, I guess I'm a peer worker, and I'm a trainer of the Cert 4 in mental health peer work. I am a mental health first aid instructor. So all of the work that I do is informed by my individual lived experience, and that includes my experience advocating and supporting for family members and friends in the community. So I'm going to give you a little bit of an overview to what we're doing today. So when I was trying to plan this workshop, and it's shaped and evolved over the last 2 years since we've been delivering it, but it was really important for me to be able to provide evidence-based knowledge that was presented from a lived experience perspective and privileging lived experience voices. I was hoping to challenge your thinking, and at the end of the day, as well as presenting ways that we foster inclusion and build the capability of individuals to self-manage their place in the world and some of the challenges presented when your experience is a bit different to most people, I wanted to be able to provide you fairly extensive resource and points of reference to ways that you can expand your learning into the future. So at the end of the session today, when we will make sure that we send out a full PDF of the slides, and in amongst the slides, there'll be hyperlinks to any videos that we play. And there's also a lot of slides that we actually won't cover. I would say about 20% of what will be emailed out to you is more than what we could fit in the program, but I hope that it's a valuable resource for you into the future. The workshop's broken up into 5 parts. So the first part is our kind of preliminaries, which we'll get through, and a bit of background to the Northern Territory Lived Experience Network. So that'll go pretty quickly, I hope. The second part is understanding neurodiversity, the experience of being neurodivergent, and human rights and the human rights movement, or particularly the disability rights movement. The third part explains a bit more about what it's like to experience the world differently. The fourth part is fostering self-awareness and creating inclusive environments. So some of the rapid improvements I've just done to the workshop today are really trying to fold in examples of some of the practices we do or we use, not just in our youth program, but also in our adult program, because while they're adult programs, while they're pitched at different communities, our methodology for creating inclusive environments and building self-efficacy and having really diverse groups of people come together, feel safe and to learn, it's kind of a uniform approach. It just looks a little bit different in practice, but the theory behind it is the same. And then there'll be a whole chunk of further resources, training and education, and we'll probably only be able to touch on a little bit of that. But again, you'll see more that comes out when the slides are emailed. There will be a 15-minute break. Sarah, my colleague, is going to keep track of the comments section of the chat for any questions. Sorry, I'm pressing multiple buttons. So if I look distracted, that's why. As I mentioned, a full copy of the slides will be sent out. And to make the session a little more interactive, we're going to be using Slido. So if you haven't already got your phone at your fingertips, can I ask that you get your phone out and go to www.slido.com and enter the number for the session. Give a couple of seconds for people to do that. When we get to the Slido slides, those details will come up again. So if you haven't quite sorted it out, don't worry about it for now. Right, housekeeping for Zoom. Okay, so I think everyone was automatically put on mute when you came into the session. If you're new to Zoom, that's what the mute button looks like. Use the chat function to ask further questions. I think Sarah's, as I mentioned, going to keep track of that and probably direct message me with them. So I'll try and answer them after the break and at the session end. Raise your hand if you need to get my attention, and that would be particularly if I've done something wrong and accidentally muted myself or something has gone wrong. I have said there, leave your camera on unless you're doing something that would be a distraction to others, but I understand we've got quite a lot of people who've joined. So, you know, just do what's comfortable for you. I know that I'm unable to keep track of everyone's faces as we go. And if you need to leave early, please just let me know by sending a direct message. And lastly, I think in red, if I'm making a Zoom mistake and you can't see or hear me or the screen, please unmute yourself and let me know as soon as possible, because I'm probably not going to catch it in the comment section. A little bit about our network, the Northern Territory Lived Experience Network. It says we are a volunteer operated network, but we originally started as a volunteer operated network, and our vision has always been to provide a collective, independent and representative voice for individuals with lived experience of mental health, alcohol, drug and related challenges, as well as family member and kin who provide love and support. So I made this slide for a different presentation, but when I think about the experiences of the adults in our community, and certainly the adults who participate in our program, there are kind of overlapping experiences between mental health related issues, suicidality and addiction. And we have a lot of people who the term is intersectionality, I guess, because of the intersectionality between being queer and perhaps neurodivergent. People are more likely to have experiences of mental health issues and suicidality. We'll see some of those stats later. But we also have some of the other intersectional experiences, or pointy end experiences, if you like. So people who've experienced homelessness and jail time. But universally, I guess, one of the experiences within our broader community, and this includes family and kin, is the experience of trauma. So everything that we do, and even the capacity building that we deliver through our peer programs, comes from a lens of understanding trauma. We're not interested in diagnoses or pathologies, with the exception of our Empowering Youth program, which actually supports celebrates neurodivergence. So we do talk about, you know, I'm autistic, or I have this and I have that, because we want it to strengthen identity. So, but otherwise, we just operate from a basis of understanding trauma. We did emerge during 2020. I mentioned, you know, what we're seeking to do in terms of our advocacy and the type of experiences that people have who are connected to our network. If you're interested, we have done quite a few systemic advocacy formal submissions, which you can look at on our website, and through our social media. There are many opportunities that we do our best to share. The requests come in thick and fast, and we have to fit it in, but ways for people to use their lived experience to contribute to national research or co-design, local co-design, you know, opportunities to share what you've gone through to help inform the shaping of services. We've delivered programs to date in Darwin, Catherine and Alice Springs, and that includes some of our workshops. This is one, which present evidence-based information presented from the lived experience perspective, and also our peer-led education and support programs. This is the biggest part of our work. So since we formed, we have developed Recovery Together, which is for adults who experience mental health or alcohol or drug related problems. It doesn't matter what brings them into the space, because the capacity building we do through those peer programs is in non-clinical recovery methods, and some of that will be covered through the workshop today. We've got a specific program for family and kin of people impacted by those issues, who are often in quite a heightened state of distress themselves, and that program is called Circles of Support. We have our Empowering Youth program, which is for neurodivergent young people, or young people who have experienced adversity. And the other part of the work that we do is we use our adult peer support programs, particularly as a stepping stone into a stepped vocational pathway from participant to Cert 4 peer worker. And our staff have all at one time been participants of our programs. Our work's nearly always evaluated, because peer work is still emerging in the NT. So we have a strong partnership with Flinders University, and both of our adult programs have been evaluated several times. So these are, just to give you an idea, flyers. They're all the Catherine programs, because we've got quite a bit of work on it in Catherine at the moment, and some of our staff have just come back from Alice Springs, and also in the Darwin region, we've got Circles of Support currently running, and the Empowering Youth program running as well, and we will have a recovery together coming up in term 3. So this is a bit annoying. I have not worked out how to clear the poll from last time. Let me go back. Perhaps people can just use the chat to I wonder if I can just reset it. Oh. I think if you just join, we can average your energy level today with the previous 5 participants. Oh no, there weren't 5 participants, there were a lot more. Anyway, we'll average your energy level with the folks who attended in Catherine on Wednesday night last week. Hopefully we'll see the energy of this group push up the average, because their program was started at 5:30 p.m. and ran until 8:30 p.m. So I can see a couple of people have participated. Okay. I would encourage people to go. You can use your camera to scan and enter the QR code. We've got a few more of these Slidos coming up later in the program, so it will be a good way to engage and stay alert. Okay, well, I saw it go up a little bit, so I'm going to keep going now. So we've still got a moderate to low amount of energy at this time of day. Right, just a quick note. It's hard, you know, in a group like this, our participants are coming from a wide range of backgrounds. You've got fairly limited interaction because it is an online meeting. But in terms of the way that you interact, particularly through the chat, because it is the only way probably you'll be able to interact, unless we've got time. If our numbers stay low and we've got some time for questions and are running ahead around the time of the break or the end of the session. But my point is, anyway, long way around. If we think about our attributes as an iceberg and our experiences and our needs, the things that are least visible to others are some of the most vulnerable things. So the best thing we can do is not make assumption about anyone else's lived experience in the group that's joining us today, to communicate in ways that are curious, still respectful, and not stigmatizing. And, you know, I have no doubt that the community of people who are joining us through the webinar include people with individual lived experience, as well as experience providing love and support to a family member. So just be gentle with yourself if today's session does bring up big feelings. We are going to cover some stats later in the program that talk about co-occurrences of neurodivergence with suicide, and some of that is a little bit concerning, particularly if you're a parent of a neurodivergent young person. So I just want to flag that now, that will come up a little bit later in the session. Something else I want to note is how important the use of language is, and the way we talk about neurodivergence and the way we talk about particularly young people's behaviour when they are in earshot. But I think also if they're not in earshot, that the risk of, describing the experience of neurodivergence using deficit language kind of enshrines that in our thinking, and ultimately that will translate into our actions and interactions with young people. When I think about the type of language that I use, I actively try and avoid disability and deficit type language. So when we're talking about mental health conditions, my preference is to talk about conditions instead of disorders. Also to use the phrasing mental distress instead of mental illness. We like to talk about people and not consumers. And we like to talk about family and kin as opposed to carers. That said, what's really important is that we reflect the language chosen by a person, and some family member and kin really, the term carer is really important to them and their role supporting their loved one. So that's their preference and their choice. I also try to use the phrasing diverse abilities or different abilities or different ways of experiencing the world instead of disability. You'll notice that I use the term autistic to self-describe, and a lot of autistic people will. It's about reclaiming that word and making the statement that it's an important part of my identity. But for the most part, we don't kind of use language that ends in ick, if that makes sense. So the term schizophrenic is not a term a lot of people will use to self-identify. It's actually a highly stigmatizing term. However, that said, so we talk about the person's experience. So person has schizophrenia or experiences schizophrenia. One of the other exceptions, like the term autistic, I guess, is that a lot of people in recovery from addiction will self-identify with the term addict. And again, that's their choice and their preference. But I wouldn't ever use the term addict to describe someone else. It's kind of a self-claimed and term. Right, so we've got another Slido question, and I'm dreading whether it's going to work right now. But the question is, why did you want to attend the session today? And we've got some of the prior comments from the Catherine group there. So hopefully as you guys populate it, your answers should appear further down the list, but I'll just read a couple while you're doing that. So I wanted to come to, this is our Catherine group. I wanted to come today because this knowledge would be useful when working with participants, to have a better understanding of neurodiversity, understanding more about how best to support neurodivergent young people in a school setting, to extend my abilities at work and to support my participants as best I can. I'm also very interested as a neurodivergent adult myself. I'm a teacher, but also an adult with ADHD, diagnosed after 30, and I have experience with a large number of children from remote communities experiencing trauma. To learn more about the industry and individuals I work with, I wanted to learn some new tools to help support the students I work with. My daughter has ADHD. I want to learn strategies, to learn new approaches in my career, to help understand the students I work with. It will also help me share knowledge to staff, build on my knowledge to help support young people I work with, expand my knowledge, learn more about people with diverse abilities and additional needs, better understand the people we work with, wanted to find baseline knowledge among people in BRR. I'm not sure what that means. I work with neurodivergent students, support my family, professional development, and further my understanding. So some very okay. Oh, there's a question that popped up. There are more strategies as we go through, but we'll get there in the end. Okay, so we're going to, all right, another comment, can't access Slido, ways to support a young person, which sounds like they have some very diverse strengths and other uncovered talents, which sounds wonderful. Okay, so that's our preliminaries part out of the way. So we're going to just look at this concept of neurodiversity, and we'll talk a little bit about the rights movement and how that actually, that social justice engagement, we'll hear from a young autistic advocate as well, how that social justice movement has been a really important part of strengthening identity for individuals. And that has been that importance of having strong identity connection, and also, I guess, helping the world to be inclusive and have your rights met is a really empowering and an important part of living your best life, not just for neurodivergent people, but any other person who, I guess, has the lived experience of being othered, if you like, by society. And so we'll present that case and actually link it back to what we know about the evidence of recovery, because it is the social justice, strengthening identity, meaning and empowerment are fundamental elements of what we do and part of the theory I'm hoping that you understand and take away. So when you're thinking of ways to create inclusive environments and to support neurodivergent young people, you actually understand the theory behind the reason why, what you're trying to achieve. And then you can, it's not just a case of me coming in here and saying, oh, we do this, you go away and do that. Because if you understand the theory, you can translate that knowledge and come up with your own solutions and strategies. So let's move on. So there's a little TED Ed video that we're going to watch, and it's actually interesting. It's, what is this concept normal? Where does it come from? And we'll see that normal really isn't normal. We'll talk about neurodiversity as a concept, and then we'll go from there. So I'm going to play the video, and I'm really hope I'll be extra quiet, but I'm hoping the sound works well for you.
In 1945, two sculptures meant to represent the average man and woman in the United States went on exhibit at the American Museum of Natural History. Based on measurements taken from tens of thousands of young men and women, they were called Norma and Norman. That same year, a contest launched to find the living embodiment of Norma. Normal is often used as a synonym for typical, expected, or even correct. By that logic, most people should fit the description of normal, and yet, not one of almost 4,000 women who participated in the contest matched Norma, the supposedly normal woman. This puzzle isn't unique to Norma and Norman either. Time and time again, so-called normal descriptions of our bodies, minds, and perceptions have turned out to match almost no one. And yet, a lot of the world is constructed around a foundation of normalcy. So what does normal actually mean? And should we be relying on it so much? In statistics, A normal distribution describes a set of values that fall along a bell curve. The average or mean of all the values is at the very center, and most other values fall within the hump of the bell. These curves can be tall, with most values inside a narrow range, or long and flat, with only a slight bias towards the average. What makes the distribution normal is that it follows this curved shape. Normal doesn't describe a single data point, but a pattern of diversity. Many human traits, like height, follow a normal distribution. Some people are very tall or very short, but most people fall close to the overall average. Outside of statistics, normal often refers to an average, like the single number pulled from the fattest part of the bell curve that eliminates all the nuance of the normal distribution. Norma and Norman's proportions came from such averages. Applied to individuals, whether someone is considered normal usually depends on how closely they hew to this average. At best, such definitions of normal fail to capture variation, but oftentimes our calculations of normal are even more flawed. Take the BMI, or Body Mass Index. BMI is a measure of weight relative to height, with different ratios falling into underweight, normal weight, overweight, and obese ranges. Generally, only BMIs that correspond to normal weight are considered healthy. But BMI is not always an accurate predictor of health, or even of what's a healthy weight. BMI doesn't take into account body fat percentage, body fat distribution, levels of physical activity, or blood pressure. And yet, those who fall outside the so-called normal range are commonly advised that losing or gaining weight will improve their health. When we apply a standard of normal to all of humanity that's based on data from a non-representative slice, we're not just choosing one point on the distribution, we're choosing it from the wrong distribution. A lot of behavior science research draws from samples that are pretty weird, meaning Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. These features can skew norms even in research that doesn't have an obvious link to them. Take the famed Mueller-Lyer optical illusion. It's normal to think one of the two lines is longer when they're actually the same length. At least if you're an American undergraduate. A team of anthropologists and psychologists found other demographic groups were much less susceptible. Members of the San people of the Kalahari weren't susceptible to the illusion at all. When these limited or inaccurate definitions of normal are used to make decisions that impact people's lives, they can do real harm. Historically, such concepts of normal have been hugely influential. The eugenics movement of the early 20th century weaponized the concept of normal, using it to justify exclusion, violence, and even extermination of those deemed not normal. To this day, people are often targeted and discriminated against on the basis of disabilities, mental health issues, sexual orientations, gender identities, and other features deemed not normal. But the reality is that the differences in our bodies, minds, perceptions, and ideas about the world around us, in short, diversity, is the true normal. And speaking of deeply flawed systems of measurement, how much do you know about the dark history of
We don't need to watch the next one. I think I've just reset the Slido poll, so we shouldn't see the Catherine Group's answers when we do the remaining. I don't know, things are all right. 1 second. Okay, so what that little video told us was that the term normal comes from statistics, and it's not a point. Normal is actually a distribution or a range that sits under a bell curve, and it's diversity that is actually normal. And most people are diverse, and that's to be expected. What about the term neurodiversity? So neurodiversity is a term that came out of the autistic rights movement, and it was coined in the late 1990s by an autistic advocate, Judy Singer. Judy is an Australian sociologist who is autistic and herself, and rejected the notion that autistic people's brains were broken or disabled. So coining the term neurodiversity was a platform for championing the equal rights of autistic people in education and society, and to say that it's not disabled, it's just different. And the Stanford University Neurodiversity Project defined neurodiversity as a concept which regards individuals with differences in brain function and behaviour as part of the normal variation in the human population. So it started when Judy Singer used it to describe the experience of autism, but a significant many other experiences of the world have now adopted and self-identify with the term neurodivergent. So that includes sensory processing, dyslexia, dyspraxia, sensory processing, I said that, sensory processing differences, but Tourette's, face blindness, as well as Down syndrome people are using the term, people with cerebral palsy, and we're seeing more and more that people with the lived experience of mental health conditions are using the term neurodivergent, and in particular psychosis, which is really, I guess, highly stigmatized, very, deficit focused language used around that experience. So why is it important? Well, one of the reasons neurodiversity has been adopted by so many people who have different minds is because it differs to the medical model, and the medical model views those different experiences of the world as disorders, and that they need to be not just treated and cured, but prevented. And most neurodivergent people and other people traditionally viewed as disabled or less abled understand at a very personal level the harm caused by the medical system and how painful it is when a whole system which informs, governments and decision makers views our existence as something that should be prevented, treated, and cured. So the medical view, also the strongest voice influencing political leaders and system decision makers, and it's the medical, and because of that, influence right at the top of the chain of power in societies and countries and communities, that's what filters out into society. Whereas the concept of neurodiversity promotes a more nuanced perspective of what's normal. And instead of naming cognitive differences or differences in the way of thinking as disorders, the concept of neurodiversity seeks to elevate differences as strengths. And at the same time, it still acknowledges that people experience challenges and they require support, but the term just seeks to neutralize the imbalance of power created through the use of really pathologizing language. Neurodiversity doesn't force individuals to conform with a clinical decision of normal, and it's actually a term that says it's society that needs to change and become more inclusive. So the social model for disability as opposed to the person model for disability. And that society can and should make accommodations for people who are different by providing support, adaptive technologies, adaptive environments. And when we do this, we're actually able to make more inclusive and accessible communities for a range of other people, not just the individuals who have the difference. So while the present day treatment and language around people who have different experiences of the world is far from perfect, as we heard in that little video about the concept of normal, it's been pretty horrendous in the past, and the video made reference to the eugenics movement. I want to present a little bit of our history and the way, and I'll do it from the lens of mental health experiences, which is very similar. It's accessible for me because of the work that I do, but it's, you know, the description is similar, and similar things have and atrocities to people with different abilities or disabilities have occurred through the ages as well. But a lot of the rights and the level of inclusion that we do experience today and protections have only come about because people with disability have fought for those rights. So it's not come about because of the goodwill and exceptional leadership of governments and decision makers. It's actually come about from people protesting that governments and decision makers have not met their responsibilities. So we'll have a bit of a look just very rapidly, you know, 5000 BC, in terms of having mental health experiences, the accepted view was that you were possessed by supernatural forces, in particular demonic possession. Around the 1400s, it was a crime to have to be demonstrating mental distress. It was viewed as a choice, and people in mental distress were put in jail. And so their treatment was was horrific and inhumane. And then around the 1750s, there was recognition that mental distress wasn't a choice. It was actually a disease of the brain, and it was no longer a crime. But instead of putting people in jail, large institutions called asylums were created, and people in distress were taken pretty much out of sight, out of mind for treatment for the rest of their life. In the early days, there was some consideration given to staff-patient relationships, but treatment was still really harsh. And this was the beginning of forced institutionalization of people in mental distress or with disability or with what's considered disability. So in the 1800s, there was the rise of asylums. They were overcrowded. However, during this time, we start to see psychotherapy emerge as a bit of a discipline. And Sigmund Freud and other psychotherapists like Carl Jung are starting to publish research related to theories and treatment. So instead of just packing people away, there's actually thought to how we can help people to recover. And during the early 1900s, psychiatry as a discipline emerged really and was on the rise. And on the basis of the mental distress being caused by brain malfunction. And early psychiatrists were not subject to the ethical constraints that they are now. So there was a lot of sort of experimentation. We talk about the eugenics movement. There was a lot of experimental treatments on people. And so the recommended treatments, for example, in the 1930s, included high doses of insulin, and camphor and other injectables, which were actually intended to bring on seizures. Electroconvulsive therapy was common, and in the 1940s, brain surgery emerged, so the lobotomy. And to put that into context, a quarter of people who were given lobotomies died, and the rest survived with a permanent brain injury. So that was also the era that there was development of pharmacotherapy. It was in the 1940s that an Australian psychiatrist stumbled upon lithium as a treatment for bipolar disorders, and it's still one line of pharmacotherapy treatment that's commonly used today. We saw around that time some people became well enough to leave institutions. You'll notice also within that era, in World War II, there were hundreds of thousands of adults and children who were murdered or institutionalized as the result of World War II. So there was, I guess, the World War II atrocities extended probably beyond what people understand in terms of the violence toward certain populations. And on the back of World War II, the United Nations formed and said that these atrocities should never happen again. And in 1948, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was got up and was signed by I think most countries of the world, and just declaring that there was a universal set of rights and they must not be violated. Yet, despite, oh, hang on, go back one. Despite oh yeah, okay. Despite that Declaration of Human Rights, there was no change in automatic change in circumstances for people with disabilities. Oh dear, I'm not very good monitoring the slides today. So between the 1950s and 2000s, that's where we saw the disability human rights movement occur, and communities of people with disability all around the world, I guess, also inspired by the civil rights movement, began to come together and say, look, this is not good enough. Why is there this Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but our rights are not recognised? And so in the 1960s, that was really strengthening. And even as recently, I believe, as the early 2000s, there were people in disability rights advocates in Australia still chaining themselves to the front of trams in Melbourne in protest that they were not able to access public transport. So, of course, the work and the fighting done by those folk is the reason now that others, such as mothers who push prams, are also able to access the tram system. In the 1970s, the mental health or the community kind of joined the broader disability rights community. And so there were movements, consumer rights groups such as MAD, Pride, and the anti-psychiatry movements that kind of started and kicked off around the world. So we're going to watch, it's just a snippet of a film called Defiant Lives, but it speaks to the tremendous work done by disability advocates and which continues to continue to challenge imbalances of power and create more inclusive environments and communities.
I'm tired of all the well-meaning non-cripples determining what I can and cannot do to form my life and my future. Get out of our way.
Was bashing something you ever saw in
there? Yeah. Oh, yeah. A lot.
Nobody wants to live or go into a nursing home.
Nursing homes are jails for people. They're jails. They're warehouses. They're where America has decided to stick its disabled people and let them rot until they die.
Sooner or later, you have to come up with the proposition that these issues are political.
And I think for many people, it was just the most exciting thing that had ever happened to them in their whole lives.
We had this two-day action where essentially almost everybody just got arrested.
I can tell you, the outrage of disabled individuals across this country is going to continue. It is going to be ignited.
We aren't asking for civil rights, we're demanding them, and now.
The idea that you can focus on society as the problem rather than impairment or a condition is a radical idea.
There's this famous catch cry on disability, and it's nothing about us without us. When we're involved and included in change, that's when good change happens.
This is about everybody. We're socialised into the assumption that if I become disabled, I don't want to live. That's all very well. When you become disabled, chances are your life will seem completely different.
It's a really wonderful documentary. It's normally played in December each year during, I think, around the celebration of human rights, which I think is the 10th of the 12th, and International Disability Week. Sorry, I can't remember. My brain, it's escaped me. Look, the reason I wanted to show you that video is because it speaks, I guess, to what we know about the evidence in support of recovery. And when I say recovery, I mean recovery from really significant mental health issues or really significant drug and alcohol issues. It's recovery from the type of experience that kind of completely knocks you off your feet, onto your face, onto your bum, whatever it is. And as a result of that experience, you have to redefine and reestablish your place in the world. And mental health recovery particularly is not about going back to who you were. It's about living your best life. And it's like experiencing any other chronic condition such as diabetes or asthma. It's about getting on with it. You make accommodations, but it shouldn't hold you back from living the life you want to lead. So the evidence around recovery, the strongest evidence comes from a paper by Mary Leamy, and it's the CHIME model for recovery. And I just wanted to pop it up on the screen. This is one of the models, and there are a couple of other models that we use, which underpin all our thinking in terms of the way we work with people through our peer programs and to support them basically to increase their self-confidence, their self-efficacy, their ability to manage their life and ultimately to live their best life. So in the research done by Leamy, they went through all of the literature published around the world, and they actually looked for people who were describing what supported them to live their best life or their recovery. And then they took all that information and they grouped it up and organized it by themes. And they identified these, I think there's about 26 of them up there, different themes which were touched on in all these different narratives relating to recovery. And they broadly organized them into the 5 domains, and they're overlapping domains, so connectedness, hope, identity, meaning, and empowerment. And the ones that you see there in blue, personal responsibility and control over life. So in terms of mental health recovery, they're the strongest things you can do to support someone to realize or access their recovery. And then the second strongest enablers for recovery are the ones in purple. So support from others, having a quality of life, and having a positive sense of identity. Now, from the context of a neurodivergent person, as well as people who have mental health experiences and are trying to recover from challenges such as alcohol or substance use disorder, we know that the evidence is really clear that empowerment and a strong sense of identity are really important. So I just want to make that connection back to social justice and the disability rights movement and the importance of feeling like you're able to make change and make experiences better for the broader community or community of people like you. And it's also, I think, visibility of neurodivergent role models, in particular adults, talking openly about being autistic or neurodivergent, and in ways that are strengths-based, and, you know, do acknowledge the challenges of it, but that are strengths-based. What we do is we help to normalize these experiences for young people. Peer supports, in, you know, for any group that is marginalized or stigmatized or othered, if you like, in the broader community, peer support can provide really safe spaces. And I think, generally speaking, you know, our role talking about diversity is what is normal, and we should, you know, be grateful for diversity, and celebrate diversity is an important message to communicate, and also working from a position of strengths. So we'll talk a bit more about how we do that in practice in our programs in a minute. There's there's a little video here. It's from Shadia Hancock, and we're just going to watch part of it. But Shadia is actually a young autistic advocate, and in this video, we're going to watch the first part, but talking about their passions and interests, but moving into talking about how social justice and helping to raise awareness, even when a high school student, amongst the teachers, about the experience of neurodivergence was a really important part of Shadia's journey. So we're going to play part of Shadia's story now.
My name's Shadia. I'm a proud autistic advocate and the owner and founder of Autism Actually. And today I'm going to be talking about my passions and pastimes and how I'm spending my days in isolation. So let's begin. Some of my passions are mainly around animals and advocacy work, specifically horses and dogs and the world of neurodiversity. Horses have always been a big interest of mine since a very young age, about the age of 6. I used to beg my parents for horse riding lessons, and at the age of 10 I finally got my wish, and it was one of the best days ever. Dogs as well have been a big part of my life since about the age of 7, when I got my first dog. He was a black Labrador named Charlie, and he was a beautiful boy. And then after that, I got a Ridgeback rescue named Marley, and she was also a beautiful dog. And I've been enjoying spending lots of time with my new addition to the family, Freya, who is a puppy, and she's very cute. She's currently asleep next to me. Advocacy has been a big part of my life ever since the age of 13, which was around the time I started exploring my autistic identity. I'd worked out being autistic at the age of 8, but at high school I started becoming more self-conscious about it. I remember seeing an autistic advocate speak at a school event, and after talking to him I was inspired to do the same. I conducted a workshop for teachers at about the age of 14 because I was wanting them to understand how being autistic feels like, particularly in a school setting. And my entrepreneurship teacher suggested it as a business idea and helped me get my business up and running. So that's been going since I think about 2015, which is pretty amazing. Specifically around animals, something that's increasingly become of interest to me is animal-assisted therapy, particularly as I'm a speech pathology student. Incorporating this into my work is something that I'm really interested in pursuing. And of course, looking at service and therapy dogs and how that can help people in our community. I'm hoping that Freya will become my assistance dog, and I'm sure that this will give me valuable insight into the assistance dog training process and how this may help future clients. So some of the things I'm doing in isolation.
So I'll just pause it there, but it's I think it's lovely to hear Shadia talk about those interests and passions including their importance to their identity and how Shadia is now actually folding them into the career or the work that they're embarking on as a young adult and speech pathology student. So we're moving into the second part of the workshop now. So we're about an hour and a little bit in, and I hope that it's okay if we persevere for a little bit longer before we take a break, and we might take a break at about in 20 minutes time, about 4 o'clock, and we'll take a 15-minute break. So we'll keep going. So having a look at the experience of autism and other sensory processing differences first, and then we'll have a look at a few other bits and pieces. So we used to see autism represented like this, as a very kind of linear experience, and in regards to communication, it ranged from non-verbal to verbal. Social interaction ranged from aloof to unusual, repetitive and restrictive behaviours, and sensory processing ranged, oh hang on, am I getting this right or wrong? I can't, yeah. Oh, okay, sorry, yes. Repetitive and restrictive behaviours range from mild to marked. Sensory processing, under to oversensitive. Information processing, and then intelligence was part of that description as well. But what that gauge didn't really acknowledge was any strengths-based language, and it is very deficit orientated. So Rebecca Burgess is an autistic illustrator from the UK and rejected the linear representation of autism. In 2015, they came up with the round spectrum to represent the different ways a brain can process information. And a mark toward the outside of the circle indicates that a person may need less support in that area, whereas a mark toward the middle of the circle indicates a person may need more support in that area. And when Rebecca created this representation of the experience, they said, I want people to understand that autistic people don't all fit into the stereotype, and show people the consequences of stereotyping. Stereotyping leads to underestimating the skills of autistic people, or not believing someone who's on the spectrum. So for example, because they can communicate, or because their social skills seem quite honed, but that's because they're doing a lot of masking and imitating. So you'll notice that Rebecca has also flipped the language into strengths-based language. So instead of repetitive interests, Rebecca uses strengths and interests. And instead of social interactions, Rebecca uses connection to culture and community. And Rebecca's representation of autism has been increasingly adopted, and Positive Partnerships, who is the federally funded, or a federally funded national program to support schools through providing training to both educators and families. They've adopted Rebecca's representation of the experience of autism and kind of rejected the linear definition. So we're going to watch a little video now. It's just Temple Grandin, well-known autistic advocate, and an American scientist in animal behavior who transformed the entire livestock handling industry with her system innovations, not in spite of her autism, but because of her autism. Temple's superpower is that she's a very visual thinker, and her ability to see a perspective that other people were unable to, and that includes other autistic people. So if you've met one autistic person, you've met one autistic person. Like Temple's experience of the world certainly doesn't reflect mine experience of the world, and probably every other autistic person's experience of the world. But what's important to note is that Temple didn't speak until she was nearly 4 years old, and her mother was actually encouraged to institutionalize Temple, which she didn't. So this is just a little trailer about the film. Again, you can watch it. One of the reasons that I wanted to play it is because it highlights the importance of working with someone around their strengths and how incredibly far people can go.
You know, you never get cured of autism. But what you do is you learn better, is you learn more and more things.
Well, I didn't speak until I was 4. Now I have a BA and a master's, and I'm studying for my doctorate.
I can remember the frustration of not being able to talk. I couldn't get my words out. My speech came in gradually, a few words at a time. When I was a little kid, I was very autistic, nonverbal, rocking. You know, that's the kind of kid they just put away in the institution. But I had a speech teacher that worked really hard with me, and I can't emphasize enough the importance of young children getting early intervention. You got a 2-year-old or 3-year-old with no speech, don't wait. High school was absolutely worst part of my life. Teasing, teasing, teasing. I got kicked out of school for throwing a book at a girl, teased me because, you know, teasing really made my life miserable. And the only places I could get away from teasing was the specialized activities. Things like horseback riding, electronics lab, model rocket club. The line was drawn in the sand. I was not allowed to become a recluse in my room. I had to get out and do things. I'm always kind of baffled at just how illogical people are in their thinking. I'm very logical in my thinking, but when I was younger, I didn't know that other people thought more in words. You see, I think in pictures. If I don't have a picture, I don't think. And my mind is very, very associative. Being a visual thinker, I tend to put things into categories. You see, autism is a very big spectrum. At one end of the spectrum, you got half the people at Silicon Valley. And then at the other end of the spectrum, you've got somebody who's very handicapped, remains nonverbal, is going to have to live in a supervised living situation. Really, really big spectrum. And you know, Einstein probably be labeled autistic today in a lot of school systems because he had no speech until age 3. I'm interested in seeing something that makes real change. I've done a lot of work that's made a lot of improvements in the livestock industry, and I think I've helped a lot of kids succeed. I want to see the kids that are like me succeed. That's the kind of stuff that makes me happy, when I see the things that I do make a difference.
So this is just a little clip by Temple there, talking about her movie. You know, there's a couple of little infographics here, really just wanting to highlight that autism isn't just a spectrum, that people are incredibly diverse within the autistic community. So we can have people who have delayed speech, and then we can have people who are hyperverbal or have really profound speech and reading at a very young age. We can have those that are incredibly aware about their difference from other young people, and we can have those that are completely unaware. We can have really expressive speech, and then we can have people who have fairly, you know, speech that lacks change in tone and that sort of thing. High pain tolerance, very sensitive to physical sensations, and we'll talk a little bit about our different senses and sensory profiles. And I think this is really important as well. People, there used to be a stigma that people with autism had no empathy, but the reality is many people are hyper empathetic. They're extremely empathetic people, but at the same time, that's not everyone as well. And then eye contact is also, you know, it's a pretty big deal, I would say, for most people on the autistic spectrum, but for others less so, or they've learned to cope, or they're looking at a different part of your face. So this slide is just about the myth that relates autism to intellectual disability. It's a similar, I would say it's a similar stigma probably that exists about mental health experiences, that because of your mental health experience or because you're autistic, there's an assumption that somehow that relates to your intellectual ability. So We can see that through history. In the 1980s, nearly 70% of autistic people were diagnosed with intellectual disability, but by 2014 that had declined to 30%. There is a very strong argument, and a lot of autistic advocates who are incredibly critical of the assessment tools used as an indicator for intelligence, because they're geared toward communication. And just to highlight that fact, there was a lovely little story in July 2022 where a student who was nonverbal, with the ability to access effective communication tools, was able to rise to the state, one of the state's best students in just 18 months, and says that communication has changed my life for the best, and it saved my life. So communication, if we talk a little bit about some of the differences that are characteristic of autism and other neurodivergent conditions. So communication is obviously one. So it's more than just the ability to hear and talk. It's also the ability to recognize the nuances in other people's tone, the tempo of voice, ability to moderate your own tone and tempo of voice, to be able to recognize and understand nonverbal cues, including facial expression, to what's that? Congruence between own message and nonverbal cues. Right. So to communicate nonverbally in a way that aligns with what you're saying. It's theory of the mind, the ability to read between the lines, to understand what a person is not saying, and it's also understanding social norms. So I guess I speak to my personal experience there. One of my challenges, and I just accept it, not being able to recognize sarcasm or to identify a lie, or if someone's misrepresenting something. So I have, instead of being caught up with anxiety about that, have accepted that if someone's not being authentic to me, that's a reflection on them instead of a deficit that I have. Okay, so we've got just another little infographic. I'm not going to hang on there. I just want to talk about masking for a moment. So masking is using social scripts or mimicking what you see others do or you've seen portrayed in the media. And the slide says it occurs when a person is self-aware of their social differences, but I've actually met a lot of later diagnosed autistic people or adults who've recognized they're autistic later in life, and they haven't realized how hard, or that they even were masking for their whole life. It had just become automatic. But what they did know was they were incredibly depleted and prone to meltdown or shutdown after interactions that demanded a lot of them socially. So what can it look like? Well, perhaps it can look like a young person, and this was one of my young people who spoke with a really cute little American accent, because most of their mimicking and social scripts was coming from the particular cartoons that they were watching when they were small. It can also be a really good kid, a shy and reclusive young person, which I would say I wanted nothing more than to be invisible, and that kind of persevered right through university. And it can be adopting the personas of others. So why is it bad? It costs a lot emotionally, and it's not just all that effort that goes into it. It's also, I mean, think about the importance of identity and living your best life. It's somehow that inability to be who you are, where you feel like you have to fit into the world instead of being in a world that allows you to be who you are and feel safe, causes a lot of mental health challenges. And we can see that through people using alcohol and other drugs as coping or survival strategies, or even engaging in self-harm. Sometimes that is a coping or survival strategy as well. And just that, all that co-occurrence with, you know, depression, anxiety, other mental health experiences, including suicidality. Eye contact. Many autistic people do struggle with eye contact. Some people can't maintain it at all. I know that for me, eye contact decreases with my level of distress or my if my emotional reserves are decreasing, then my eye contact just diminishes. And you know, if I'm in confrontation or someone has hurt me, I will not even be able to kind of orientate my body toward them, let alone maintain eye contact with them. But for other people, they might be so good at masking that they have excellent eye contact, and you wouldn't realize that they're on the spectrum at all. Or then there's people who use too much eye contact because they feel that that's an appropriate thing to do. So if we talk a little bit about our senses in our body. Now there are 8 senses. Most people think there are 5, but there's not. There's 8, which we'll have a look at them in a minute. But we all have unique sensory profiles, every one of us. So sensory processing isn't just an issue that's linked to neurodivergent experiences. You might not be you could well be neurotypical, not neurodivergent, and have your own, quite diverse sensory profile. So if we think about our senses, there is touch or tactile sense, there's vision, there's gustatory, I'm losing language, so oral sensations, taste, hearing, auditory, so there's smell, olfactory, so proprioception, our sense of body and space, vestibular, which is our balance, and interoception, which is our sense of inside our body. So being able to tune into what your body feels like. And people can have over-responsive senses or under-responsive senses. And they can also, so for example, I am hearing impaired, which makes this a bit of a challenge. So I can't hear high frequency sounds very well, and normally wear hearing aids. But I generally have over-responsive hearing. So that means for me, I have trouble filtering out a lot of the background noise, and I find that really exhausting. So when I go into environments where there's extraordinary amounts of background noise, I can't stay in there very long because it just completely depletes my emotional reserves and my ability to cope, or it narrows my window of tolerance, which we'll talk about later. I also I need to wear sunglasses all the time outside. I know other people have colleagues who have even more visual sensitivity than me and will be impacted by the fluoro light. So they have an oversensitive response to vision. I hope it's okay, it's not on there. The other point I want to make is, so we can have this over or under responsive sense, but then we can also be sensory seeking or sensory adverse. So I could have an over responsive be over responsive to oral sensations or taste and texture, and seek a lot more of that. So I might be constantly chewing on things, tasting, and I'm thinking about, sorry, one of my children again. So quite over responsive, but also seeking input and wanting to do more of, taste more things. And when that child of mine was younger, that suggestion by the OT was to you can get more crunchy foods and have straws around the house, because that way they're able to meet their sensory needs. But then there might be another young person who is overly sensitive to taste and oral sensations, but they're also sensory avoidant. And so they will only eat specific foods, or, you know, they won't want anything that's crunchy, or they won't want anything that's mushy, or that sort of thing. So you can be over or under responsive, but you can also be seeking or adverse in all those different ways. So if we talk about interoception for a moment, oh, hang on, we're going to talk, yeah, proprioception and interoception. So vestibular is our sense of balance. So do you avoid, do you like being on swings? Yes. Maybe you're seeking input to your vestibular. Proprioception, so the body's ability to sense itself in space. So what that looks like is our ability to judge distance, whether we can move around without looking, whether we can move fluidly, do we use the right amount of force to move around, pick things up, can we avoid bumping into stuff. Interoception is our ability to sense ourself on the inside. So can I identify whether I need to go to the bathroom? Am I aware if I've you know, hurt myself, or I'm carrying sore shoulders and back? Can I identify if I'm hungry or if I'm full? Can I notice the tension? Can I feel my breath? Do I notice my breath? That sort of thing. So proprioception and interoception. All right, so we've got, I might leave this video and allow people to go back and look at it later, because I'm just a little bit aware of the time. So that's actually Temple talking about sensory processing differences. And I just want to touch quickly on more so on stimming than on sensory issues. So stimming, short for self-stimulation, and just like everyone has a different sensory profile, absolutely everyone stims. You just might not realize that you do it. So if you might be someone who needs to doodle or scribble on a piece of paper while you're in a webinar like this, because it helps you to stay alert. You might be someone who, you know, bounces your legs or fidgets. It's still a form of stimming. It meets a need, whether it's to help you to stay alert or it just feels good. For a lot of neurodivergent people, stimming actually helps them to self-regulate. And we're going to talk about self-regulation later. So self-regulate is actually your ability, it supports your ability to participate. So it helps people to soothe, feel calm, feel good in the world, and a really important coping strategy. So I kind of think about, you know, some of a middle age when I think about being in the classroom and other people in the classroom who would just repeatedly get in trouble because they couldn't sit still, and how that impacted their ability to access their education because they actually weren't allowed to do what they needed to do to self-regulate, feel calm and listen. Instead, they were constantly in trouble. Yeah, so I just wanted to make that point about stimming. It's not something that's unique to the experience of neurodivergence. Everyone stims, everyone has a sensory profile. So we might take a 15-minute break now. And when we come back, we'll keep moving on, having a bit of a look at neurodivergence and some of the differences that make our experience of the world a little bit different. And then we're going to speed through some information so you understand the prevalence and rate of co-occurrence of these issues. And then we're going to talk about the strategies that we use, and probably the biggest one that we use is the way that we support not just our young people, but our adults also to develop self-awareness, because without self-awareness, you can't self-regulate. Telling someone to self-regulate and just showing them like a 5-point scale that says when you're at 5, you've got to do all these strategies. It's not going to work unless that young person or that adult is able to tune in when they're at a 3 and 4. And what does that tuning look like? Because it's more than, it's things like doing body scans. It's noticing what you're feeling, the type of actually noticing sometimes the difference in things of what you're saying or how loud your voice is or whether you're starting to swear. So anyway, we will take a 15-minute break and come back at 4:18. Hopefully everyone's back now and can see my screen and hear me. And if that's not the case, please say something in the chat. Okay, so we're going to come back and talk a little bit about executive functioning. So which includes things like impulse control, emotional control, or can impact these things rather, flexibility of thinking, working memory, self-monitoring, so self-awareness, planning and prioritization, task initiation or ending a task, and being organized. So what can be difficult? So having self-awareness and being able to self-direct your attention appropriately, and speak to that. Self-restraint, so not responding with your first thought, non-verbal working memory, so holding things in your mind to guide your behavior, verbal working memory, so retaining internal speech, emotional, using words and images along with self-awareness to alter how you feel about things, motivating yourself to do things when there are no outside consequences, and planning and problem solving, so new approaches and new skills. So there's a little infographic there where the person says, sometimes I really want to start a task and feel as though I have a lot of energy to do so, but I just am unable to start, like all my thoughts are stuck. Similarly, once I've started a task and completed the first stage, I find it really difficult to know the next stage, and it can be overwhelming. Swapping tasks is also quite challenging for a lot of people as well. So we're going to privilege the lived experience voice again and listen to a young advocate who is ADHD, and her channel is actually called How to ADHD, describing the experience of executive functioning for her.
Hello, brains. I was going to start this episode with me juggling a bunch of different tasks to demonstrate a situation that required way too much executive function. But I realized getting all the props for that and figuring out how to act it out and film it properly required way too much executive function. Did I use that term right? What is executive function? According to our How to ADHD dictionary, executive function, noun, is a set of cognitive processes that help us self-regulate so we can effectively plan, prioritize, and sustain effort toward our goals. Executive function is kind of like the CEO of the brain. It helps us go from wanting to do a thing to actually getting it done. And there's a lot that goes into that. The cognitive processes that make up executive function are things like response inhibition, which helps us not be impulsive, working memory, which helps us hold information in our head temporarily or remember it while we work with it, set shifting, which is what helps us shift between tasks that have different cognitive demands, and the ability to delay immediate gratification so we can achieve long-term rewards. In ADHD, the research term for this is delay aversion. These functions help us with what people often call being an adult, which makes sense because executive function is located in the last part of the brain to develop and doesn't fully develop until around the age of 25. In ADHD brains, it takes even longer. According to ADHD researcher Dr. Russell Barkley, executive function in ADHD is up to 30% delayed, which is why those with ADHD can seem immature. And even once it does fully develop, it's still impaired. So some of the things parents do to support their kids' executive function: make sticker charts, lists, put away distractions, create routines. They might have to do more of, or for longer, for their ADHD kids. And as adults, we often need to do this for ourselves. This is so critical for those of us with executive function challenges that Dr. Barkley compares it to building a ramp for someone in a wheelchair. It's a necessary accommodation if we want to get to where we're trying to go. Not everyone with ADHD has impairments with all of the cognitive processes involved in executive function. For example, one brain's working memory might be just fine, but everyone with ADHD does have impairment in executive function overall. Often it's not that we don't know what to do, it's that we don't have the executive function to effectively do it. So if you or someone you love is having a hard time getting things done, you might ask, is this actually about effort, or is this an executive function issue? When trying to create an ADHD-friendly environment, you might consider what would make things easier on executive function. If there are behaviors you want to discourage, you might ask, what would require more executive function? How could I make doing this thing harder? And if you're having a bad brain day because you didn't sleep well last night, you could say, my executive function isn't doing great right now. Maybe I need to skip the complicated intro. Because, as my good friend Eric Tivers puts it, we can do hard things, but we don't need to do them in the hardest way possible. You can check out some of our videos on ways to support executive function here, and we're going to be going deeper into different executive functions in future videos. Thank you to my brain advocate.
She's got quite an extensive channel and great advice in a whole realm of areas. She mentioned in the video that executive function is one of the last parts of adolescent brain development. And I'm sure most people attending the webinar today are aware that the brain actually doesn't finish developing typically until the age of 25. And during adolescence, there is an extraordinary number of changes happening in the brain. So that can, cause issues. It's also the time we see the emergence of mental health challenges in some young people. So during adolescence, there is, broadly speaking, 3 different areas of development. There's physical development, which when a young person goes through puberty or hormonal changes. There's secondary sex characteristics, including an increase in weight and height, and a significant amount of brain developing that's going on. And if I remember correctly, about 25% of the kilojoules used by the body during adolescence is consumed by the brain. Psychologically, adolescent young people are establishing their own identity and autonomy that's separate from their primary caregivers, and starting to experience or at least think about intimacy. Their advanced thinking and reasoning is also developing. And then socially, there are changes including becoming comfortable with their sexuality, their personal identity, their autonomy or independence, and intimacy with others. And achievement is an important part of social development as well, especially in an educational sense. So just to turn now and think a little bit about mental health and how, well, for a start, what it is and how some of the neurodivergent experiences can make it more likely for a young person to develop mental health problems. Mental health, people often hear the term mental health and think or assume that you're talking about a mental health problem, but mental health is actually a continuum. So on that continuum, we have good mental health and we have poor mental health or a mental health problem if it goes on for long enough. And we're kind of moving along that continuum all the time. And just because we're not experiencing a mental health problem doesn't mean that we have particularly good mental health either. So just like our physical health, where there are things we can do. So if we eat well, sleep well, get enough rest, that bit of sunlight that we need, fresh air, all those things, we can promote our good physical health. We can do the same with mental health. We can intentionally do things that promote good mental health. And a lot of the things that are good for our physical health are also good to do for mental health as well. Our thoughts, our feelings, our behavior, but also our what we feel and experience in our body are all linked. So we used to talk about mental health, or and still really it is. It's the cognitive triangle, which was thoughts, feelings, and behaviors, was always used to is always generally used to explain mental health and mental health problems, which we'll look at in a minute. But in the work that we do, we always bring in and acknowledge the body and particularly so we can tune into warning signs in our body, because they're great ways to develop self-awareness. And I would say particularly for neurodivergent people who can have trouble naming their feelings or identifying their feelings. And actually, I think for most people, having the ability to reflect and observe your own thoughts is also challenging as well and takes practice. So if we can tune into our body, it's particularly helpful to grow self-awareness and the warning signs of having a meltdown, shutdown, or a full fight, flight, panic attack. So the cognitive triangle, I mentioned thoughts, feelings, behavior. That's how we would typically see it represented, but we always bring in the body as well. And so this is an adaptation from the definition by Mental Health First Aid Australia. And it says that when our thoughts, feelings, behavior, and even how our body feels, there's a major change, and that change interferes with our ability to get on with life, like our functioning, our ability to sustain social relationships, to think in the workplace, to think at school, to feel motivation, etc. If that goes on for enough time or longer than would be expected, then that's a sign of a mental health problem. And we should, if that's us, we should probably go and talk to someone about that. If that's something we notice in someone we care about or someone we're in contact with, we can encourage them to go and talk to someone as well about their mental health. So it's those changes to our thinking, our feeling, our behavior, our body that are impacting our functioning. So there's no single reason or cause for people to develop a mental health problem, although we do know that certain groups of people are more at risk. And what we do know is the chance of developing a mental health or a related problem, such as a alcohol, drug, or gambling, or other substance use related issue, that increases when a person's exposure to risk factors significantly outweighs their exposure to protective factors. And there are different ways or different models that can actually be used to understand a person's exposure to risk factors. I'll present one on the next slide, which is the biopsychosocial spiritual model that helps us understand how certain factors, actually I might do it and then come back, certain individual risk factors and risk factors in our environment increase the probability of us developing a mental health problem. So biopsychosocial spiritual model, it's made up of 4 domains, overlapping domains. And what it says is that a person's exposure to experiencing a mental health problem goes up when they're exposed to a range of risk factors that broadly fit into these 4 different categories. And the domains are drawn as overlapping because, I mean, you could see some of these examples could fit into different parts of the model. So biological factors, they're things related to the body, so hormones, genetics, experiencing a physical illness or injury, being sleep deprived, having a diet that doesn't meet our nutritional needs, perhaps consuming too much alcohol or substances, constant stress, they'll change our body. So there's some of our biological factors. Psychological factors, so the way we think in our coping, so those things can be learned through our upbringing. They can include our attachment to significant other, experience of trauma, although trauma could fit anywhere in that model, exposure to stress, bullying, just our natural pattern of thinking, particularly if we've got like automatic, a lot of automatic negative thoughts, like black and white thinking or very perfectionistic. Social and environmental factors, so are we safe? Can we live in a safe environment? Are we experiencing peer pressure? Are there services around we can access? Have enough money to access the services we need? And then spiritual cultural factors. So some examples might be being excluded from your place of worship for reasons outside of control, or having a spiritual crisis, or being disconnected from culture or from land, or or other elements that we know contribute to a strong identity. So if we just go back to this slide, which I showed before, that's just one model which helps us understand the layers of risk that a person can be exposed to. And again, risk is always offset by protective factors. So, you could have a person exposed to a whole range of risk factors, but still not develop a mental health problem. And that's because they've been buffered. Those risk factors are being buffered by protective factors. But there's another important model, the window of tolerance, and that helps us understand the impact of trauma or constant stress. And that same model we can use to understand how we can help people to cope with those experiences and help them be empowered through self-awareness and self-regulation, so that they're not constantly tipping into fight, flight, or meltdown or freeze or whatever, so that they can live their best life. And the other model, which is not covered in this presentation, but it's the social determinants of health model. And that model just kind of supports us to understand why some people are at those pointy intersections I talked about, and why they're exposed to more risk factors than other people. And it has nothing to do with who they are as an individual. It speaks to the society in which they're born, grow, and age, and how that translates into their experience of health. So I'll just fast forward a little bit. So just to support us going into talk about the window of tolerance model and ultimately ways we can support a young person to be self-aware and develop self-regulation, I just want to talk about trauma. So trauma is a very common experience, not just in the lived experience community, but also in the Northern Territory. We have very high rates of stress, mental health, substance use, and suicidality here. And knowing that trauma is a massive contributor to those experiences, we know that a great many people have exposure to trauma and are not able to bounce back from that. It's having ongoing impact. So the way trauma is defined is emotionally or physically harmful or life-threatening situation, and that some people have an ongoing impact to their emotional, social, spiritual, and or physical well-being. So what does that look like if there's an ongoing impact? Some people can be easily startled, get a fright, and people learn to adjust by not wanting to sit with their back facing a door or that sort of thing. Hypervigilance is what it's called. They can be easily triggered into a distress state, have difficulty regulating their emotions, be it increased risks of long-term mental health problems or use of alcohol and drugs, distressing dreams and intrusive thoughts. So the way I would describe trauma, and then these are my words, is the experience of being powerless and in a insignificant distress with no control over your circumstance or way to protect yourself and or your loved ones. And it's that experience or ongoing experience or series of experiences that contributes to this kind of manifestation of trauma symptoms. So there's a little video here that we're going to watch. It's by the Anna Freud Foundation in the UK, and they do a lot of work for the UK government around understanding trauma. But what this helps us to understand is specifically how trauma can impact young people and ways that we can better understand and support those young people when we're working with them.
Brain development is much more than a story about biology. From the earliest years, relationships with others play a key role in shaping how our brain grows and develops. Early relationships, where there is abuse and neglect, have a long-term impact on children. A brain that has adapted to survive in a threatening or unpredictable world may not work so well in an ordinary environment. This can create what is called latent vulnerability, where early abusive or neglectful experiences with carers put children at greater risk of experiencing mental health problems in the future. For these children, compared to their peers, common experiences like moving to a new school can feel more daunting and stressful. New faces can appear threatening, while positive social cues can be missed. It can be harder to negotiate new social situations and learn to trust new people. Even fun experiences like joining a new sports team can be challenging. Too much focus on potential threat cues can mean missing out on positive social cues such as a playful nudge. Or it causes an overreaction, which leads to an increased risk of conflict and sometimes violence. These reactions can increase the likelihood of generating new stressful events. It's harder to deal with everyday challenges when you feel unconfident and anxious inside, and harder to build and maintain relationships. Over time, this can mean a child loses friends and the support of adults, and so misses out on opportunities to grow and develop. This social thinning can increase the risk of mental health problems in the future. Neuroscience research is beginning to shed new light on how vulnerability unfolds over a child's life. All children need care and stimulation from adults who value them and who show them attention and love. These experiences shape a child's brain development. When children face traumatic experiences like abuse and neglect, their brain adapts to help them cope. We know of changes in 3 different brain systems: the reward, memory, and threat systems. Experiences of domestic violence or physical abuse can lead to hypervigilance, where the brain reacts more to threat. This might help a child stay safe in an early adverse environment, but it can cause problems in more ordinary environments. Hypervigilance can best be understood as a pattern of adaptation, rather than a sign of damage. Abuse and neglect can also mean a world where a child's basic needs for care and attention are not met. This can shape the brain's reward system, the part of the brain that helps us learn about positive aspects of our environment and motivates our behaviour. Over time, the brain's reward system can learn to respond differently to things like positive social cues. Neuroscience studies have also pointed to changes in the autobiographical memory system, our memory of everyday past experiences. Following trauma, negative memories appear to become more salient, which means they become more prominent than positive ones. And everyday memories can also become less detailed. This is a problem because we need to draw on past experiences to help us deal with new social situations. Neuroscience research is showing how childhood trauma can create latent vulnerability, increasing the risk of later mental health problems like anxiety and depression. This vulnerability is not just located in the child, but arises through their relationships. Helping children who have experienced trauma still requires ordinary boundaries and consequences, but it also requires us to step back and reflect and see behaviour that we find challenging in a different light. A child may simply be doing their best to survive now, with brain adaptations from the past. We know a child's brain has the capacity to continue to adapt. For this to happen, they need our help to build and maintain trusted relationships, manage everyday stresses, and prevent new ones from happening. We need to encourage them to try again and believe things can be different. This is far from an easy task and takes time. Science is helping reframe our understanding of childhood trauma. Seeing children's behaviour in a new light can mean we respond differently. But there is much still to learn. Working together, we can develop more effective approaches that promote resilience and recovery. We can help children build trusting relationships and create opportunities for their brains to adapt in new ways.
So that just, I hope, helps us to understand, or maybe not judge behaviours that we witness in young people, particularly if they've been exposed to trauma, and also recognising that you're not necessarily going to know that that young person has been exposed to trauma. So hopefully encouraging you not to judge too quickly. We're going to talk a little bit very quickly about the prevalence of mental health conditions and then about co-occurrence. So when we look at young people aged 4 to 11, ADHD is considered the most prevalent experience by young people in that age group, and that's in any given 12-month period that these particular national studies. So when we look at any mental disorder, don't really like using that language, but that's what the study's called. It's about 1 in 7 young people would experience a diagnosable mental disorder. When we increase the age or look at the slightly older cohort that are 12 to 17, we see anxiety move past ADHD in terms of its prevalence or how frequent it is in young people in any given 12-month period. And again, it's still about 1 in 7, a little bit more, 1 in 7 versus 1 in 7.3 of young people. So if you had a classroom of 28 children, then there's 4 or 28 young people, 28 adolescents, there's 4 young people in that classroom that would meet a diagnosable mental health condition. That's not to say that those 4 young people have a diagnosis, but that's what they estimate based on the surveys that they do, where they ask about symptoms and experiences, and from that infer who would meet the diagnostic criteria. As we get older and think about young adults aged 16 to 24 versus adults aged 16 to 25, we're able to see that the experience of young adults is significantly higher in terms of mental health problems than the average for adults across the lifetime. So anxiety is higher in young adults. Depression or bipolar disorder is sitting about the same, and that's because depression tends to emerge a little bit later, which we'll see in a bit. But the criteria for meeting a substance use disorder is much higher, and as about 1 in 4 young adults versus 1 in 5 adults across from 16 to 85. And those figures are for who would meet the diagnostic criteria in any given 12 months or in any given year. So these stats show the median age of onset, and the median age of onset is the age by which half of all people who'll ever be diagnosed with one of these mental health problems will have received their diagnosis, or it will have the illness will have emerged, or the mental health problem will have emerged. So we can see that anxiety, for anyone who will ever experience anxiety in their lifetime, half of all people will have had their first episode by 15. For eating disorders, half of all people who will ever have an eating disorder, that experience will have emerged by 18. For substance use problems, and this is important because the legal age of drinking is 18, and alcohol use problems far outstrip other substance use problems. But the emergence of a substance use problem is by the age of, for half people, is by the age of 18. For depression, the median age is a bit later, the age of 25. But for any mental health problem or any mental health disorder, the median age of onset, so half of all people who will ever have an experience will have their first experience by the age of 18. These other stats just kind of highlight that point, I guess. They show probably what they show more clearly, if you're a visual and statistics person, that is that females experience common mental health conditions at much higher rates than males, and particularly in the age group of 16 to 24. And you can see they're more than 45% of young females versus about 31% of young males are impacted. And that kind of continues into the next phase of young adulthood, 25 to 34. So now these stats were not easy to find, and they're not particularly easy to understand either. So this is looking at the prevalence of autism specifically by age group, and the data was measured for different age groups, so 0 to 4, 5 to 9, 10 to 14, etc. and that data was captured in 2009, 2012, and 2015. The Australian Bureau of Statistics said that the way that this data was captured could over or under represent estimates related to autism. So just to treat it with caution. But what it does show is a couple of trends which are interesting. One is that the downward trend, or what appears to be, is older people are less likely to be diagnosed with autism than younger people. And we also see that between 2009 and 2012, between 2012 and 2015, that there's quite a step up. So there's more young people being diagnosed with autism. So I want to share for a moment an interesting series of events which was uncovered about autism and its history as a diagnosis. And this was put together, or this was kind of determined and by a journalist called Steve Silberman, or a writer, I should say. And there's a really excellent TED talk about it, as well as Steve Silberman's book. So I think it's important because it demonstrates to us how awareness of autism as a condition actually occurs in the 80s and 90s, and how that, as that information kind of disseminates around the world and into the medical fraternity and between educators, we start to see the rates of autism rise. So the forgotten history of autism was brought to light by writer and editor Steve Silberman, who began researching the topic in 2010. And this, I just want to share it with you briefly. So Steve determined that in 1943, American child psychiatrist Leo Kanner published a paper with his discovery of autism. And Kanner's paper was based on 11 children, and he defined autism using very selective diagnostic criteria, making it a very rare condition. By the 1950s, Kanner would emerge as the world's leading expert of autism, which he said was caused by cold and unaffectionate parents. No one challenged any of Kanner's theories until the 1970s, when a London-based cognitive psychologist, Lorna Wing, who was also the parent of a profoundly autistic daughter. So she rejected Kanner's theories of cold parenting as rubbish. And to make the case to the National Health Service in the UK for support, Lorna and her colleagues undertook a study of the general population by actually walking the streets of Camberwell in London in search of autistic children. And they found lots of them, way more than what Kanner's model predicted, and they wondered how no one had noticed the children before. So then Lorna discovered a paper written by Vienna-based psychologist Hans Asperger, which was published in German in 1944. And because of the time it was published and where it was published from, it had basically been relegated to the ashes of World War II. Kanner knew about the paper, but never mentioned it in any of his work. But because Lorna's husband spoke German and translated it into English for her, the paper actually provided an alternate version of autism. And I'm sure you've already recognized Asperger's name. So Hans Asperger ran a combination clinic and residential school in Vienna in the 1930s, and his theories are considered progressive even by today's standards. And the residential school that he ran included music, plays, morning exercise routines, and Asperger did not blame parents for their children's autism, but actually framed autism as a lifelong polygenetic disability, which required compassionate support and accommodations over one's life. Asperger called his patients little professors and viewed autism as a diverse continuum that spans an astonishing range of giftedness and disability. And he believed autistic traits were common and always had been. And he went so far as to say that for success in science and science and art, a dash of autism is almost essential. So Lorna worked with the American Psychiatric Association to broaden the definition of autism. And in the late 1980s and 1990s, those changes, because of Lorna and her colleagues walking the streets of Camberwell and redefining the classification, came into effect. And they swapped out Leo Kanner's very narrow definition of autism. And so changes to the criteria, as well as an increase in the profile relating to autism from movies like Rain Man and access to diagnostic tests, meant that diagnoses of autism around the world started to grow. So when Steve Silberman had kind of put all this history together, by 2017, when he published his book Neurotribes, he'd actually been able to go back and confirm the link between Kanner's work, and even the person who had come out of Asperger's clinic, fled World War II and gone and worked for Kanner. He'd been able to confirm that Kanner knew about the work of Asperger and just kind of was determined to go ahead and make a name for himself that ignored the significant work done by Asperger in the 30s. Anyway, so I just wanted to share that. Also, I want to acknowledge the timing as a parent of neurodivergent young people, particularly when they were younger. I found it, everyone's entitled to think what they think, but I found it particularly difficult when people would say things to me about vaccinations, and that's why my children had autism. So I guess I wanted to share this history of autism to make reference to why the rates of diagnosis grew, and also just to reiterate that the paper linking autism to vaccinations was completely debunked, and the person who published that paper, I think, has been prevented from practicing their work anymore for writing that. So, all right, but let's look for a moment. So set aside prevalence of autism and some of the myths around autism. Let's talk about some of the facts around autism, particularly because it does co-occur quite significantly with mental health. It's definitely something we need to be aware of, highlighting the importance of making accommodating environments. So I'm going to whiz through this, but so this is from a paper that was presented in 2022 that I attended. So conservative evidence for the co-occurrence of autism with a mental health condition is at least half of people with autism meet the criteria. So it's not 20% or 1 in 5, it's at least 1 in 2. And some other studies are saying 70 to 80% of people experience mental health conditions. So we know that it's when risk factors outweigh protective factors. And I think we understand enough about risk factors, stigma, exclusion, bullying, places and environments that are not inclusive, that how those risk factors contribute as opposed to the lifelong polygenetic condition, as Hans Asperger would say, that they present more of a risk of developing a mental health condition. Just to reiterate, co-occurrence is when it's a term just used when there's 2 or more health conditions, in this case 2 or more mental health conditions. And the most common co-occurring mental health conditions are depression and anxiety with autism. So people with autism are 3 times more likely to make an attempt on their own life. They're 4 times more likely to die by suicide. They're more likely to be exposed to traumatic events, partly the reason why I wanted to communicate an understanding of trauma, and we will look at a trauma model to support self-awareness and self-regulation, and also more likely to have a traumatic response to those traumatic events. We also know that autistic people are more likely to be gender and or sexually diverse. And many people are misdiagnosed or because their autism isn't recognised, and it might not be recognised, and it's often self-identified in people, but there are actually quite a few people who are misdiagnosed with other mental health conditions before they determine that there is an autism diagnosis. And one of the common misdiagnoses is borderline personality disorder, which is a highly it's a diagnosis that's actually stigmatized and discriminated against by healthcare providers. So it can be really challenging for someone who's been given that label to actually access care and support. So let's have a bit of a look now about how we can promote self-awareness and self-regulation. So I mentioned before the CHIME model. This is really important to how the type of activities that we do, but also the way that we do them. So are the things we're doing empowering? Are they fostering connectedness? Are they strengthening identity? Not just specific activities designed to strengthen identity, but the way we do them. The social and emotional wellbeing model, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander social and emotional wellbeing model is also incredibly important. It is describes Aboriginal people's ways of being and doing, but it is so holistic that if we think of it as a structured approach to mental health, well-being and living our best life, it's actually really comprehensive, and non-Indigenous people can interpret and translate parts of that as relates to them. So for example, well, I'll show for example, the other model that we use as a guide is basically flipping that biopsychosocial spiritual model for risk on its head, and we turn it into body, mind, spirit, and the world around us. So what can we do to strengthen our body and health, strengthen our mind and emotions, make the immediate environment and the world around us feel safer and more receptive, and to explore spirituality and culture. So they're the 3 models that we use and guide a lot of. They guide not just the work we do with adults who are experiencing mental health or substance use problems, or the programs we use to support the coping of family and kin. These models also guide our way of working with neurodivergent young people or young people who've experienced adversity. So I'm just going to flick through quickly here. What you can see is the ways that their different models overlap. And at the end of the day, we look at how we can support people or how we can build the skills of people to support them in these different domains of their life. Then we're supporting them to live their best life from social and emotional and well-being and recovery method. Okay, so self-awareness and self-regulation. This comes from understanding trauma, in particularly the work by Dan Siegel. It's what is presented in all 3 of our programs. Our young people learn about it. We're teaching them the same skills that we teach adults, and that's how to be self-aware and to have the skills to self-regulate. So we break it down. We start with saying self-awareness is tuning into what you're thinking, feeling, doing, and even how your body feels. Self-regulation is so that you can identify if you're about to flip your lid and stop it from happening. For our adults, self-awareness is recognizing changes that show you're at risk of becoming unwell or a risk of relapse, so that you can put in place the recovery plan that you've made. I'm missing one. There's one there that says self-awareness is understanding what other things that are likely to trigger you and cause those big responses, so you can plan ahead to try and avoid some of the situations that will cause those big responses, like for me, going to really noisy environment, or if you do go, how to make a plan to minimize the impact that it's going to have to your ability to self-regulate. So we need to be self-aware. So we can't self-regulate unless we've got good self-awareness. It's not an easy thing to do. It's not something that should be expected of young people as easy, because certainly it's something that we spend a lot of time teaching adults how to do. But ultimately, it's what we need to be able to interact with the world and live our best life. So we introduced the relationship between thoughts, feelings, behaviours and body. And we introduced the concept of trigger, as well as talking about trauma and how trauma or exposure to constant stress can have an impact on our reactivity to triggers. So we say a trigger is something that'll change that relationship. It will change how you think, feel, what you say and do, and even the feelings in your body really quickly. And alongside that relationship, we introduce our brain gauge. And we use our brain gauge as a way of explaining what happens when we're triggered. So if we take green as you're feeling good, your mind is calm, so you're able to problem solve, you're interacting socially, you're feeling relatively good. And then we talk about blue and red as flipping your lid and going into survival mode. And then we call yellow or amber is the small zone of warning before we flip our lid. So we link our brain gauge actually to the tachometer on a car. And the reason we do that is because, which we'll show in the next slide, we teach Dan Siegel's hand model for the brain, and the tachometer helps us to understand what's happening in the nervous system of the body. So if we say the red zone is a person going into fight, flight, panic, or meltdown, and in the red zone, our car is on full revs, that's when our nervous system is flooding our body with messages from our brain. And in our blue zone, when we're in freeze, dissociate, or shutdown, then our car is stalled. We're numb, we're disconnected, the messaging is almost non-existent. And in both of those states, a person is in survival mode. They're not in control of their response. They've gone too far. So Dan Siegel's model for the brain, hand model for the brain, talks about your upper, and some of you I'm sure are familiar with it. Upper brain is for thinking, socializing, and problem solving. So that this front part of our brain here, the lower brain or the ancient brain, the limbic brain, sits deep inside our brain. It's responsible for instinct and survival. It's the reason that humans still exist on Earth, because our lower part of our brain, our limbic brain, is able to kick in and just respond immediately. And then our brainstem and our spinal cord are at the base of the skull, and they transport messages from our brain to our body through our nervous system. So when we're in the green zone, our brain looks like this. We're feeling good, our mind is calm. Our upper brain and our ancient brain are connected. They're talking to each other. They're working in harmony. But when we're in the yellow zone, which might only be for a very short amount of time, the upper and lower parts of the brain are not quite working in harmony. They're starting to disconnect. And when we've gone fully into the red or the blue zone, they're completely disconnected. So you're not able to access where you problem solve, where you think. You're just completely driven by your ancient survival part of the brain, and you're not fully in control. You're actually not fully in control of what your response is, and you're not able to tap into your ability to understand and process what people are talking to you about. And it's really important for others to remember, because when you're telling a young person who's in full meltdown to calm down, if anything, you're escalating their level of distress. They're actually not able to respond to your instructions, and they're probably not, not only are they not able to respond and not able to control what's happening, your voice and your tone, they might be sensitive enough to it that you're escalating their level of distress. So when you've still got a little bit of connection and ability between your upper brain and your limbic brain to communicate, this is where we want to tap into some of that pre-planning we've done about what are my strategies to self-regulate. So in order to be able to do that, we need two things. We need to know what our warning signs are so we can recognize before we do this. And we also need to know what are the self-regulation strategies that help us do this again, which actually help us to come back into the green zone. And you can't do this without knowing what your warning signs are. All right, so we use that as our justification, or I'll use that as our way of explaining what we're doing and why. And then we use in our groups, we use peer support, because people actually, and young people as well, actually can tap into quite a bit of information already about what some of their warning signs are. But hearing from others, they can reflect what someone else has said about their experience and process that to go, oh yes, I experienced that as well. It's also strengthening and empowering for them to share what they know and see that information being useful to another person. All right, so we do a series of brainstorms, and we do the same brainstorms in all of our programs. So we ask people, okay, think about when you're in this yellow zone, and we do it separately. So we do, because the red zone is quite different to the blue zone. We even in our adult program, we break the red zone down into fight, flight, panic, and meltdown. And the reason we break it down further is because the things you say and do are different. If I'm moving into flight, I'll just give you an example. If I'm moving into flight, I'm probably looking for an exit, I'm scanning and I'm backing away and I'm saying and thinking things like, I've got to get out of here. If I'm moving into fight, I'll be stepping up, I'll be making my voice louder, probably be swearing, I'll be puffing myself up. So what happens within our body and our nervous system is similar, but the way that we behave is different. So it's actually good to untangle the different parts of the red zone. So we've got prompt questions, and we start by asking, how does your body feel? Because most people, as I said, and it's even not necessarily neurotypical people, most people are able to tune in with more ease about how does their body feel, what changes in their body do they notice. Then they're better able to reflect on what are they doing or what are they saying, how is that changing. Then they might be able to respond on how they're feeling emotionally. But one of the hardest things to do is to tap into your thoughts, because actually having self-awareness about the type of things you think, especially automatic thoughts, is really hard. And yes, so we tend to, I don't know, it just feels like the hardest thing to tune into. So we'll brainstorm warning signs, and we don't have time to do it, so we're not going to do it. I'm going to pop up here, but we'll brainstorm all those different, we'll use those questions as different prompts. And it's just an example. We'll also run through some of the physical response, which happen when you go into fight, flight, panics, physiological responses. We'll do the same thing for the blue zone. We'll ask the same questions. Not everyone has that experience, so it's an opportunity. So not everyone has that experience, but also not everyone is able at that point to identify if they've had that experience. But sometimes through people with more self-awareness describing it, there will be others in the room who recognize that they've had that experience of dissociation and freezing before, which again is very important. And then we'll ask the same thing. We'll use the same approach. So what do you do to help you move from that back to that? And what are your strategies to self-regulate? And we'll tap into that group knowledge again. Whoops, I just wanted to skip forward. And we also have our list of suggestions as well. Most important, I have to say, of all, and it doesn't matter young or old, is the ability to take a break. And this is why young people in classrooms who say they need to take a break after being, you know, dealing with sensory demands and social pressures during the day, that really needs to be honoured, and not that ability to self-regulate is really important. So I just want to highlight that. It shouldn't be used, taken away, or, you know, the young person, you know, assumed to be untrustworthy. I would say that, yeah, I can't think of anything more important actually in our adult programs as well. People have got to be able to get up and walk away, or we can see some behaviours, or not behaviour, we can just see some responses that could have been avoided. Look, we did this with young people on the weekend. We actually tried it by drawing a person out on a couple of bits of butcher's paper. We recapped what we'd talked through on the slides, and then we got, you know, we, along with some young people, drew the sensations on the body, the emotions, the type of things that you're thinking and saying, and that sort of stuff, and your type of thoughts. And we did something similar for the blue zone as well. So that's a way of doing brainstorms. That's also getting out of your chair, which is good. Be good. The other thing we do and we link is the brain gauge to the window of tolerance. Again, this comes from Dan Siegel. The window of tolerance just shows how our brain gauge changes through the day. And you can see there that what those arrows are representing is you actually self-regulating. So it's you hitting the yellow zone and trying to turn back to the green zone before you get to red or before you get to blue. And this person's had a good day. Look at that. They haven't gone into the red or the blue zone at all. And they've self-regulated twice, which should be celebrated. But Dan Siegel's window of tolerance model is actually a trauma model, but it also helps us understand the experience of being under constant stress as well as trauma, because what constant stress does, or the impact of trauma, is it puts a lot of pressure on our window of tolerance and it squeezes it down. And so what happens is that the demands or the activities that we're normally able to cope with, we're not able to cope with, because we're more easily triggered into the red or the blue zone. So that helps people to appreciate that concept. The easiest way, I guess, for you guys to understand it, if you're listening, is just think, what's my morning routine like if I haven't been able to get to sleep? And how do I feel trying to do the same tasks I would normally do every morning? But good news is that we can widen our window of tolerance. And so that's how we provide the incentivize, I guess, for our young people or adults to start practicing evidence-based recovery strategies that we know will widen their window of tolerance. So again, this is from the weekend. We did it around some butcher's paper. You can see this is us. Oh no, you probably can't see that on my screen, but the squiggles represent how our day might go. And that's, you know, having conversation with a young person who's also talking about how their day goes, doing different things. And down the bottom underneath the brain gauge, we can see a little bit of brainstorming done there about, again, reiterating the self-regulation strategy. So going to a dark room, listening to music, being able to walk away, being alone. And this is an example of talking to young people about what are the type of things that squish our window of tolerance. So we've got sensory overload, trying to fit in, lots of people, lots of noise, feeling pressure. That's someone being mean to me. So we've got an idea, and then these are ideas to help discuss with the young people about what we can do to open that window of tolerance. So good sleep, doing things I enjoy, and then we talk about what all those things are, bit of fitness and exercise, having good friends, having fun, etc. So they're the type of activities we do to help foster and develop self-awareness and self-regulation in all of our programs. We also go on to talk about, what is a mental health problem and health seeking. The young people will unpack it a bit more so they understand what good mental health and a mental health problem looks and feels like. So we're trying to really, it's not just about how to regulate in that moment, it's about understanding, well, if this is going on for some time and I'm having these kind of thoughts, or I'm doing these things and I'm not doing those things, I should go and get help. So we're promoting help seeking. And then in terms of other things we do to foster inclusive environments, we always set our groups up, and this is something potentially that people can do with any group. We create group values and group agreements. So we use democratic approaches, and what those group values and group agreements do is they actually call on people to be personally responsible for how they are in the group, and they make people mutually accountable to others. So we'll basically ask our individuals in our group to vote on different values, and then we're democratically coming up with what's most important values for that group to have a safe and supportive and enjoyable experience. And then we'll get a bit more specific and we'll say, right, if they're our values and that's what's going to guide our ways of working, how can we demonstrate that to each other in practice? So we don't want our peer facilitators to take a directional control approach. We want some shared power and some responsibility amongst the people in our groups. And we also, but alongside that, because we need people to be able to self-regulate, is that we promote and celebrate self-regulation. And so we actively encourage people to take a break if they need. And we ask people using visual cues to be mindful of the sensory needs of others. So we have visual signs around that says we have lots of sensitive ears. So, and we always find out who has sensitive ears, because we have some people who have a high startle reflex, other people who really struggle to tolerate scratchy sounds. And then we have universally available items to self-regulate. And so, and that is not a specific thing to our neurodivergent people. It's just something we recognize that all people need, and it actually helps them feel more comfortable. But most important, I think, is the right to pass. And if you think about that CHIME model, and what we know we're doing is we're empowering people through autonomy and self-determination. So we say, you contribute and share if you want to, but if you don't feel comfortable, you don't have to. And people are more likely to engage and share when they feel safe. In our youth program, these are a couple of little things that we do. So we talk about differences in preferences, and we use that as a segue. So this is like a kinesthetic activity. So we're getting young people to move across the room. We've got it all different. And then we get them to come up with some ideas. We get move to that side of the room if you like that versus that. So as a way of leading into a conversation that we have differences and similarities, but at the same time, there are different things we like. We have different preferences, but we all actually have same needs. So we might like different food, but we all still need food, if you like. And we start to unpack the term diversity, and we really try and celebrate diversity and difference as well. The thing we want to do, and again, this is not about the single individual or the person who might have the highest needs in a group. These are things we do in an entire group or community of people. But we build empathy. So again, this is, and the experience of understanding, or so trying to cultivate that understanding of another person's experience. And it's a little activity. It's called Finding Your Tribe. So I'll let you go back and read it later. It's actually described in one of the resources, but we basically, people have got to kind of secretly find the other people in their tribe. And what happens is, using coloured bit of paper, what happens is always one person who can't find their tribe, and they're kind of bouncing around, looking around for others. So we ask, what was it like to found a group, to the people who did find their tribe, and they're pretty happy about it. And then we ask that person who couldn't find their tribe what it felt like. And we only ever, we pre-discuss that with the person, because even as an adult who's in that role, it feels disconcerting to not be able to find other people in the group and to keep walking around looking for people. We massively celebrate strengths in what we do, and we find ways not just to identify strengths as facilitators in the people in our groups, but for our peers to identify strengths in each other. One of the things, and to learn to identify strengths in themselves. And it's a simple little activity we do, which is, we've got the strengths cards out. If someone who cared about you would describe you, what are 3 cards that they would use to describe you? And then after the fact, we go and say, well, they're actually strengths. So they're 3 of your strengths. We seek feedback. We ask people about their experience, because you're not going to know if what you're doing is successful. But more importantly than that, we ask them what we can do better and how we can do it better. And some of the best ideas for creating inclusion and supporting self-regulation have come from the very people that we're responsible for. Some of the best ideas have come from the participants of our group. And also what we're doing is we're empowering them, and we're sharing responsibility amongst the whole group. We're not just holding responsibility as the leaders of the group. We're running out of time. This is a structured approach by Positive Partnerships, and I just want to touch on this. This is their approach to creating a safe environment for supporting young people to develop self-awareness and self-regulation. So it starts with you getting to know the child and connecting with them. No one, not even a neurodivergent, especially not a neurodivergent young child, if they don't know you, if they don't like you, if they don't trust you, I'm going to take advice from you. Okay, but you as an adult, if you don't know someone, you don't trust them, you don't feel safe necessarily around them, and they give you advice, you're not going to take it either. So you need to appreciate that your role and position is not going to necessarily get you across the line in terms of taking a young person on the journey to develop their self-awareness and self-regulation. Positive Partnerships says, put your detective hat on, understand the purpose of the behaviour. We would also say, ask the young person, what happened? Why does that happen? Has that happened before? Not straight after a meltdown or a shutdown, but they probably potentially have quite good self-awareness around what their triggers are. So instead of you trying to deconstruct it and decode it, ask, the young person, what happened before that? Was there anything that made you feel upset, or were you tired? Were you hot? I don't know, whatever. Get that advice and get them talking. You're developing their self-awareness as well. Number 3, consider if the behaviour is harming the person or others. Is it interrupting their learning or the learning of others? Is it affecting their quality of life, such as relationship? If the answer is no, accommodate the behaviour. Don't just accommodate the behaviour, use your influence to grow a more inclusive, non-judgmental and respectful community around the young person. Be an ally and help to create a more compassionate society. If yes, then start by making changes to the environment. Use the practices, the ones we've shared and others that will be all through the resources of hidden slides you can't see, to teach self-regulation skills, not just for that young person, but for everyone in the group. Your other neurotypical children still going to have a 1 in 4 chance of probably developing a mental health problem, and more often than not, it's going to be anxiety. So these are really useful life skills. Remember, self-regulation can't be taught without self-awareness. No person can know what to do when if they can't see the signs or the cues. And mastering it takes practice, a lot of practice. Co-regulation is helping a person when they flipped their lid in the moment. It does not include words like calm down or stop that or breathe. Co-regulation, I'm just going to skip ahead to it, is literally, in my experience, and I'm a person who has panic attacks and had a pretty horrific year of it in 2023, is literally someone beside me, slowing their breath in a way that's audible to me, not saying anything, side by side. And eventually I will tune in and my breath will sync with their breath. That has been the most successful form of co-regulation that has helped me in a panic attack, and also that, having since experienced it, I have used with other people who were dysregulating as well. Okay, well, I am going to flick very fast and just say we have a lot of resources in the back end of the presentation that are full of hyperlinks. They include resources that support young people and their families to understand their rights. They include a resource to help people, give them a structured approach to self-advocate. It's actually being written for mental health in the NDIS, but it is such a beautiful model and I've applied it every time I've needed to self-advocate. There's links to online information and free training. Positive Partnerships is amazing. Emerging Minds is amazing. BU has some great stuff. There's also some fantastic programs through Beyond Blue, Mental Health First Aid Australia, and different mental health first aid courses. Some more information about our programs and workshops, including what's in them. And then there's some online links for neurodivergent storytelling, and including local people. There's quite a few online communities for neurodivergent adults, including several local communities, which are really helpful to know about. They're gaining popularity, and it's great to see more people feeling confident about sharing their neurodivergence, and now we just kind of got to get that role modeling out to our young people so that they can similarly feel strong about their identity. And then the whole back end there is just more links, resources, and infographics, which are quite useful. So hopefully there are still a few people here. I am going to stop sharing if I can work out how to get my mouse across, and leave it with people if you have a question and you want to hang around. Otherwise, say goodbye, and I really hope you've registered with your email address so we can follow up with slides. And please also fill in the feedback form. We need that information to share with our funders, so hopefully we can get more funding, and also so we can discover what is better, what we can do to make the presentation better.